Let me present you Alan Holub, a programmer, consultant, trainer, author, good person, good speaker. I'm pretty sure you have a lot to say to the audience during your talk.
I probably have too much.
I'm following you on
Twitter,
and I mean it's new insights every day, pretty much.
Yeah, I have too much to say. I always suffer from having too much in my talks, not from not enough. So,
okay. Well, let me stop sharing my screen, and I will go off the screen as well. So the stage will be fully yours.
So should I just start when you disappear?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And just to energize you a bit, maybe we have at the moment 170 people on this video call.
Yeah.
Quite many. Okay, good luck. Good luck.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. The subject of this talk, let me get started here. Oh, there we go. Some slides. Look at that, slides. The subject of this talk is agility in general. But as you can see, the approach I'm starting with is Orwell's approach, is that George Orwell wrote in 1984, a long time ago, and the book was in many ways prescient. And the four principles of his dystopian state, I think at this point all apply to Agile and agility. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to go over what I mean by that. And I'm also going to talk about how to solve some of the problems that are addressed. So let's start. First, also before I start, notice that I've got my contact information up here. That's for a reason. When we don't have much time, I'm probably going to go all the way to the last minute here, which means that questions will be happening on Slack. But if you have additional questions, please feel free to email me or get hold of me on Twitter. Is that I'm more than happy to talk to you. So let's go through them in order. We'll start with war is peace. Of course, in Orwell's dystopian world, the point of they were in a perpetual state of war. And the government was trying to convince them that that was a good thing, that you needed to stay in war in order to be living in a peaceful society. And in a sense, we see that in the Agile community as well. Is right now, what's happened is that we have warring camps with respect to processes. We have the Scrum people, we have the SAFe people, we have the Kanban people, we have the XP people. This is basically dysfunctional. Is that the real issue with any kind of Agile approach is that processes really don't matter. And I'll have a way more to say about that in a moment. But the notion that the processes are somehow at war with each other, or that's a good state of affairs, or that the processes somehow don't connect and work together is really a bad, destructive notion that we have to get past. The second point that Orwell brings up is freedom is slavery. And that's a particularly important issue in the Agile communities. We are enslaved to the processes that are pushed by big Agile. As we are Scrum shops, or we are SAFe shops. And that's all we do. We are identified by the process that we're doing. And again, we're told that this is the route to freedom, that by implementing a particular process, we are going to somehow be more agile. We're somehow going to be good or do things better or get good results simply because we're using a particular process. So this enslavery to the process is a horrible thing. But again, big Agile is trying to convince us that it's a good thing because, of course, they're making vast amounts of money off of doing that. Orwell's third point, ignorance is strength. Well, you are told that as long as you understand the process that you have bought into, that everything is fine. You don't need to know about any of that other stuff. And that's basically wrong also, is that Agile is all about learning. The more that you know, the better a job you can do. And to argue that somehow certification is important and that if you learn the stuff that you need to get the certificate, that's sufficient. That's really, again, not working against us or working for us, but it's certainly working for the people that are trying to sell the certificates. And then finally, Scrum is Agile, which is something that Orwell didn't say, but I will add it myself, is this notion that somehow by doing a process like Scrum, you're going to be Agile. And that's just not true. So let me dig into some details about why I'm saying all this and what we can do about it. First of all, this is a picture of what most companies look like when I come in as a consultant. Now, of course, if a company was in good shape, they probably wouldn't talk to me. But more often than not, this is the result of an army of Scrum trainers or an army of SAFe consultants going through an organization and claiming that they're going to turn it into an Agile organization. They just leave a swath of destruction in their path, which clearly is not doing anybody any good. Now, I guess it's doing me some good because I wouldn't have work if there weren't people that were doing this kind of damage. But do you really want that kind of damage in your company? Probably not. Which means that the approach that most people take to being, quote, Agile, which is to bring in the experts and to have them tell you what to do, it just doesn't work. A real expert, I put myself in that category, of course, but a real expert in Agile is working hard to be unnecessary. So they won't leave something like this in their wake because the company itself is going to be in control. Is that some Agile consultancies, for example, bring in an army of consultants to make you Agile. I don't do that. When somebody brings in me as a consultant, what I do is train your people to be Agile. And that's the case with just about every really top-notch consultant that I know of. So this whole idea of bringing in an army of trainers and having them somehow make you Agile, that's really a flawed notion. And what it does is leaves this kind of destruction behind. So in order to understand the problem, let's talk for a moment, not about cars, but about systems. A car is a system. A system is made up of parts. And those parts all have to work together for the car to be able to take you where you want to go. In other words, the point of this system is transportation. The point of the system, of the car system, is to get you from point A to point B. And the only way you can do that is that if all of the parts that comprise the car work together. If you take any one of them in isolation, you will not achieve the goal of the system. If you were to pull the engine out of this car and sit on it, you would not get 1 foot further or 1 meter closer to your destination. Is that the only way to get to the destination is to have everything together, to have them all working together. The other issue about the car that's important is that no one piece is any more important than any other piece. If the wire that goes to some controller breaks, the whole car stops working. If the fuel port that goes to a fuel injector breaks, the whole car stops working. Is that it all depends on everything working together. And nothing is more important. If you went out did some research and you found the best possible engine that anybody ever made, and you put that in a warehouse, and then you go find the best possible brakes that anybody made, and you put that in a warehouse, and then you go find the best possible tires anyone made, and you put that in a warehouse, and you keep doing that until you have all of the parts of a car assembled in your warehouse. Well, do you have a car at that point? And the answer is no. And can you even build a car at that point? And the answer is no, because the parts don't even fit together, much less work together. So a system is much, much bigger than its parts. And the focusing on one part doesn't help, right? There's a myth in many software development shops of the 10x programmer, the 10 times programmer, the person that's 10 times more efficient than anybody else. Well, again, think of that in terms of our system. You could get a Ferrari engine and put it in a Yugo, but it wouldn't help you much. For one thing, it would probably tear the car apart if you turned it on. So the real issue there then is that 10x programmer is going to be doing more damage than anything else because they're not working as part of the system. Putting a bigger engine in a car means you have to change the whole car. You have to change the way that the engine is mounted to the car. You have to change the drivetrain, and you've got to make it stronger, which means that you've got to change the axle and make it stronger, which means you've got to change the wheels. The car has to stop, which means that you have to change the brakes. And you keep doing this until there's really nothing left in the car that hasn't changed. Maybe it's the cigarette lighter or the radio. Though if this is now a way cool car, you probably want a better radio than the one that was in there to start out with. But the point is that systems are systems. You can't make systems better by tweaking the pieces. And almost all of the approaches to agility that I see when I come in as a consultant is about people trying to tweak pieces. It just doesn't work. So how do we solve that? Well, the first thing is we've got to start thinking, oops, and I pushed the wrong button, which means we were going to, here, hold on. The joys of doing live presentations. There we go. So the the issue with the system then is that when I'm brought in, I'm usually brought in to focus on engineering. There's this notion that Agile is somehow constrained to the engineering department. It's something that they do in engineering. And in fact, the whole system matters. And the system is literally everything that the company has to do to get an idea that is a gleam in your customer's eye into their hands and working. And that involves pretty much every aspect of what the company does. It touches everything from HR to obviously to the technical side, the engineering side, and the operations side, but it also impacts management. It impacts everything because it's all one big system. We cannot escape that one big system. So when you bring in something like Agile, when you say, I'm going to be Agile, you're really talking about revolutionary changes here. You're not talking about little tweaks to the system. You're not talking about doing stuff more or less the way you did them before, but we'll do stand-up meetings too. You're talking about radical changes to pretty much everything that the system does and pretty much every way that the system works. So how do you make those changes? What changes do we need? Of course, we've all seen the Agile manifesto. It's getting to be kind of a creaky document at this point. But there's still a lot of wisdom in here. And the principles of the Agile manifesto really tell you what agility is, how to get agility into your organization. Now, interestingly, from my point of view, the most important part of the Agile manifesto is nothing that anybody looks at. It's the things that people skip over. It's that preamble up at the top before you even get to the things that define what Agile is. It says, we are uncovering better ways of developing software. And of that, the most important word is that word uncovering. Agile is a learning process. It never stops. So what you're doing is constantly changing. It's not something that is just fixed in concrete. And once you achieve some result, like we know Scrum, or we get Scrum in place, we are somehow magically Agile. That's not the way it works. It's that you are constantly in the process of looking what you're doing and making what you're doing better. And that means that what you're doing is going to be changing all the time. So you might start out with something like Scrum. I don't know if that's the best place to start, but it's a start. It's a place to start. But if you're really Agile in the literal sense of the word, and that's the sense that makes sense, is you will be changing that almost immediately. You'll be looking around at what you're doing and you'll say, oh, this doesn't work. So let's try this other thing instead. So when we're talking about agility, then we are talking about change. We are talking about uncovering as we go. We're talking about learning. If you're not learning, and if you're not making changes based on what you learn, you are hardly an Agile organization. The other thing that's important, the other critical thing, I think, that really defines agility is the notion of individuals and the way that they interact with each other being much more important than any sort of process. So this idea that Agile is a process, that Scrum is Agile, that's nonsensical. Is that the important thing are the people and the way that they interact. And anything that puts the process first, anything that says, oh, we need you to follow the process, rather than talking to people and just figuring out what to do based on talking to people, right? Is that the Kent Beck once characterized Agile as do small stuff and talk to each other. And that pretty much says it as far as I'm concerned. Whether you do the process or not is irrelevant. Whether you do any process or not is irrelevant. Whether you can do whether you do the process right is even more irrelevant. And more to the point, though, a process that works in one place is not going to work in another. So probably the best example that I know of this is the Numi plant, the new United Motors plant. They used to be in Fremont, California, just down the road from me. And Numi was a joint effort between General Motors and Toyota. The Numi plant started out as one of the worst car manufacturing facilities in the world. It was awful. It had the highest absentee rate. It had the highest defect rate among cars. There was a drug problem inside the plant. It was a mess. Toyota comes in and literally within months, they turn it into the best manufacturing plant in the world. Its defect rates plummeted. People started working much more effectively. It became much more productive, which is a dangerous word in software because we don't know what productive means. But in a factory, you do know what productive means. You're putting out more cars. Certainly in software, that particular metric is not only not a good thing, it's destructive, right? Putting out more code per hour. So we're going to pay people for typing. And that's who wants to pay. Programming is not typing. Paying people for the ability to type is not going to get you good results. So code produced per unit time is probably the worst possible metric to use in an Agile environment, if there are any metrics that make sense in an Agile environment. I don't think there are, to be honest. Excuse me. But at Numi, there are measures of productivity. The plant got much more productive. So what happened? Well, at the core of Toyota's way of thinking about things is the idea of an autonomous team on the production line. Is that every workstation, every stage that the car gets through as it moves towards finished, involves a team of people working on it. And Toyota said, you team, it's up to you to figure out how to do what you do better. We up here in management, we have no idea. We're not doing the work. You are doing the work. You know how to make things better. So do that. And they empowered the teams to improve. The teams didn't have to ask permission for that. They just did it. And every team improved in slightly different ways. Of course, the teams have to talk to the teams next to them, the teams around them, because whatever improvements they make have to work effectively with the teams that are providing them with things to work on, and the downstream teams who are working on the thing that they build. But the teams themselves are the ones that made the decisions about how to work. Now, General Motors didn't understand any of this. It was a complete mystery to them. So they said, oh, great. This factory is now wonderful. And what they did is carefully documented everything that was done by every team in the organization. And they built this big pile of documentation, and they trundled back to Detroit, and they plonked it down in Detroit. And they said, do this. The people in Fremont are doing a great job. So do this. And it was a complete and utter failure. It was a huge disaster. It didn't work at all. In fact, the companies that tried to do the things that were so successful at Numi got worse. So the point here is that processes that work in one place do not transfer. What makes a process work is that the people that are doing the work invent the process. And they invent a process that works for them in their context. And you try and move that somewhere else and it doesn't work anymore. Now, I have no doubts that something like Scrum worked really well in Ken Schwaber's original team. Is that team sat down and they developed the process that worked for them. But to argue that you can somehow take that process and move it to a different team and it's going to work, no. No. It doesn't work that way. So what ends up happening then is you get a lot of teams thinking that it's going to work when in fact it doesn't. And what happens then is they blame Agile, whatever that is. When in fact, the problem is that what they're blaming is a misunderstanding of Agile. Agile is not a process. You can't learn a process, right? The whole idea of the Agile industrial complex, in other words, is what's driving this thing, is the set of organizations that are driving this thinking. The Agile industrial complex are the set of companies that benefit from working in the way that I just said doesn't work. Is that the Agile industrial complex is the certificate issuers and the big consulting companies and all of the companies that make a fortune, not by helping people, but by selling them a bill of goods. And they sell them a bill of goods in a way that is actively destructive. At the center of this is that they're not really selling agility. They're selling this fixed thing. Agile TM is what I think of it as, right? Is that it's a noun. It's something that you can buy. I'm going to go and I would like to buy 10 pounds of your finest Agile, please. And it doesn't, you can't do that with Agile. It just doesn't work that way. And then to make matters worse, they say, well, and not only are we selling you the magic thing that works, if you don't do it right, and we're the ones that get to decide what right is, you're not doing it at all. So along comes these certificates. And the certificates are treated as if there's some kind of diploma, as if getting a certificate means somehow you know something about Agile and agility, and you'll be able to do things that you couldn't do before. And that's not true. None of this is true. In fact, I would argue that if you can get a certificate in it, it is not Agile. The very fact that a certificate exists means that you do not have an Agile process, right? Because certificates are all based on rules. There's a set of rules. The way you get the certificate is you memorize the rules. And if you have memorized those rules and you have spit them back out again and you have proven that you have learned the rules perfectly, then you're a master. And that's not the way it works. That's not the way that agility works. That's not the way anything works in the real world. For one thing, Agile is not based on a set of fixed rules. Is what makes something Agile is that you're learning, that the rules are changing. And to say, well, you're a master because you have memorized the rules. Well, who cares? Right? If the rules are changing, what difference does it make that you've memorized some arbitrary set of rules that somebody else made up at some other place? This is all just, it's snake oil that they're selling. They're selling you a bill of goods. And you see that's everywhere. You see it, for example, in books like Jeff Sutherland's doing the art of doing twice the work in half the time. It's not about doing twice the work. Is that producing twice the garbage in half the time doesn't help anybody. It's not about that kind of factory thinking productivity. Doing twice the work equals productivity is thinking like you're working in an assembly line. That if you can turn out cars twice as fast, that's better. It's not. Is what we want to do is we want to deliver something that's valuable to people. And the way we do that is not by delivering things faster, but by delivering valuable things sooner. It's the sooner that's important, not the faster. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. So the basic problem here then is that we have things like Scrum. Now, Scrum, I think, for the most part, is mostly harmless. It doesn't help you any at all. There's no benefit to using Scrum, but it doesn't do much damage. It does a little bit of damage, but it doesn't do much damage. It introduces some bureaucracy that didn't need to be there, and that takes up time and slows you down. It introduces meetings that you don't have to go to, and that takes up time and slows you down. It introduces something like a backlog, which can lead to something very dysfunctional. But in general, the time that you spend managing the backlog doesn't do active damage, but it does slow you down. So in spite of the promise of twice the work in half the time, what you're really getting is twice the time. Is that by going through this ridiculous bureaucratic stuff, you get nowhere useful. Now, our salvation here really is that Scrum is a very small piece of the bigger puzzle. And if you ignore it, all of that rest of the stuff is there and it does work for you. So we want to be focusing on agility as a whole. Now, people talk about Scrum and they say, Scrum is like training wheels. If you do Scrum, you'll learn the basics. And from that, you can move on to other things. Well, my experience has been that you don't really learn to ride a bicycle until the training wheels come off. And the problem with Scrum as a start is that I've gone to many companies that are quote Scrum shops, and they never move on. Once you've adopted Scrum, or once you've adopted SAFe, God forbid, you'll never move on because there's this whole sunk cost thing. We spent all this money learning Scrum. Why should we abandon it and do something else? Which means you're not thinking in an agile way. Is that we have to be thinking in terms of learning, right? You cannot be agile and rigid at the same time. It's just not possible. So if you're rigid about the processes that you're doing, that means you're ignoring your learning. You're ignoring your learning, and nothing ever good comes out of ignoring learning. So no rigid framework, no framework with fixed rules, no framework that says this is the right way to do it and this is the wrong way to do that. And if you're not doing this, you're not doing agile. You're not agile. And none of these frameworks are agile by definition. You cannot be rigid and agile at the same time. And this thinking is propagated not just by the companies that are selling certificates and consulting, but even by the tool manufacturers. Right? Take a look at Jira. Well, people focus on Jira as if it's the salvation. Somehow using Jira is going to make you agile, which brings us back to that individuals and interactions over processes and tools. No tool is going to make you agile. And in fact, Jira is very opinionated. Jira controls the way you work. It's that what happens when people start using Jira is they start working in a way that makes Jira happy. They start using things like story points, which are a huge dysfunction. They start defining productivity by story points produced per sprint. They start looking at the behavior of individual people because individual people can be assessed and tracked inside Jira. But as I said a moment ago, what matters is the system. Jira does not give you a good view of the system. So the problem with Jira is that it's doing active destruction, is that you're putting tools above people. And when you put tools above people, you end up with something destructive. Now, people say, well, Jira is just a tool. They trot out that ridiculous chestnut, right? Is that you can't is that somebody who complains about their tools is not a craftsman, is basically what they're saying. It's not the tools, it's the craftsmanship. They say Jira is just a tool. Well, Jira is just a tool in the same way that a prison is just an apartment building. It's not a good analogy. You take a master craftsman and you give them bad tools, and they're not going to be able to do great work. They'll do better work than somebody who's not as good, who's forced to use those bad tools. But if you compare their work to the work they could do with good tools, then you're not going to get a satisfactory result. Jira is not a good tool. Now, of course, the first thing a good craftsman will do when given a bad tool is to try and turn it into a good one. That's not always possible. And with most of the agile tools like Jira, it's definitely not possible. You can wrestle with it forever, and that'll be a huge waste of time, but it's never going to be an appropriate tool. So we have to put the tools first. So the important thing here then is our agility. How do we make things truly agile? And we need to be thinking, in other words, about what agile actually means. There are many definitions in the dictionary. I like the last one, that it's nimble, that it's flexible, that it's fast. So if you have a sentence, any sentence, and it has the word agile in it, if you cannot replace that word agile with the word flexible, then you're spouting nonsense. Somebody says, we're doing agile, but you can't turn that into we are doing flexible. It doesn't mean anything. So it's not agile. That's not an agile way to think about agile. Agile is an adjective. What we care about is our agility. We want to add as much agility to the mix as possible. We want to be able to accommodate changes. Agile is about welcoming changes. And if you are using the word agile as if it's a thing that you do, as if it's a noun, then you're going to get nowhere. It is not a process. It's not something you do. If you can get a certificate in it, it's not agile by definition, because the certificates define things that you do. More to the point, what it is a set of values and a set of principles and a toolbox of things that we know work because we've tried them and they've worked in some context. Now, that doesn't mean that every tool in the toolbox is going to work for you. And it doesn't mean that every tool that you need is in the toolbox. But if you want a place to start, that toolbox gives you a set of tools that you can start with. And that's a good thing, right? Is that somebody has looked at these tools and they've decided that they're going to work. Now, people say, but it has to scale. Agile won't scale properly. But the thing is that you can't, scaling Agile usually means we add bureaucracy. And you can't make anything more flexible by adding bureaucracy. In fact, scaling is more like this kind of scale, snake scales, because we're selling snake oil. Is that the idea of scaling Agile is just nonsensical. You can't really make it bigger. What you can do is make the work smaller. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. So what Agile really is about then is making things small. Right? The only way to scale Agile is by scaling the work down. So how is work usually done? If you look at a typical organization that is a typical end-tier architecture, and I should say, by the way, that your architecture can be a problem. It's part of the system. And I do whole days-long workshops on improving architecture. And in fact, I'll be doing one here at DevTrinity tomorrow. We'll talk about building architectures that are Agile friendly. But the point here is that if you're fighting your architecture, you can't have any agility because you can't move fast enough. And this kind of end-tiered architecture is you'll be fighting it. I can guarantee it. Is that it is not an appropriate architecture for working in an agile way. Well, why not? Well, there are a bunch of reasons. One of the first ones, the important ones, is that when people work on these architectures, they tend to work in a helter-skelter kind of way. But you don't get something you can deliver to your customers until you happen to get an entire narrow vertical slice through the entire system. So that's the first point where you can get any feedback, and you can't learn if you don't get feedback. And if you're not learning, you're not agile. So learning is important. And thinking and working in a way in which you can't learn is not going to work. And not delivering means that you're not learning. So working in this way is not going to help us. Now, there are other things that are a problem with this way of working, is that from a practical point of view, the stuff that we build that we cannot deploy is called inventory in the lean world. Inventory is a bad thing. It's a liability. It's money that we've spent that we can't make any money on. And so working in a big n-tiered system, if you're not delivering, if the work that you're doing is something like tweaking a database or some technical thing, right? We'll improve this little technical piece of the system. That doesn't help you get something valuable into your users' hands. It doesn't help you with that vertical slice through the system. So it's wasteful. You're just wasting your time optimizing your database if you're not getting value into your customers' hands. Oops. So that vertical slice is important. Now, how do you get to that vertical slice? The customer is what's driving this. Now, when I say the customer is driving, though, I don't mean that the customer is telling us what to do. Whenever I bring up this quote, people inevitably bring up this Henry Ford chestnut, right? If I had asked what the customers wanted, they would have said faster horses. In fact, Henry Ford never said this. This is just made up garbage. Henry Ford was notorious for not paying much attention to his customers. Something that he did say is they can have any color they want as long as it's black. But Henry Ford was not stupid. It's that he was building something that he could sell. And when he did go out and talk to customers, which he did do, what the customers told them was not that I have to build faster horses, not that red herring. What they said is, I can't afford a horse. It's a very different problem. So the key here is that the way you work with your users is by learning what they need. And we do that in several ways as agile practitioners. We do that in several ways. Mostly we're working around user stories, which, as Chief Product Officer of Westeros, Tyrion Lannister says, there's nothing more powerful than a story for conveying not just information, but everything that you need to be successful if what you're trying to do is deliver something valuable. So stories are at the center of all of this. But a story is not a code word for a random bit of work. You see that a lot. This is the Jira disease again, is that you see somebody saying, well, it says here that we can't have requirements, that in the Agile world, we use stories. So a story must be another word for requirement. No, it does not work that way. A story is a narrative. It's a story. And it's a story that defines your user's work, not yours. It's describing your user doing something useful in the domain. Now, what that's doing is that it's allowing the customer to drive and allowed to focus on things that are valuable to the customer. Is that the stories are describing our customers' work, doing things that our system can't do right now. And what we have to do by implementing the story is make it possible for them to do the things that they can no longer do. Now, any Agile system then is rebuilt as a set of stories, a library of stories, a shelf full of them. When we build those stories one at a time, every story is an entire narrow vertical slice of the system. It goes from an idea, it goes, well, in terms of implementation, it goes from a user interface all the way through to the implementation. So when you build a story, you're building everything that you need for a user to be able to do something in the domain that they didn't used to be able to do. And if you are releasing something other than that, you're not working with stories. It just doesn't work that way. But if we're working in an Agile way, the work has to be small. We need to work as small as possible. For one thing, if we have a big chunk of work, there's a lot of hidden small work inside that. If a story is something that takes even a whole sprint, right, 2 weeks, I would wager that probably half of the stuff that you do in that 2 weeks, if you're just thinking about the big story, is stuff that you don't need to do. It's stuff that nobody cares about. But because you're focusing on the big story rather than little bits of work and getting feedback, then you are wasting time working on useless stuff that nobody wants. And that's obviously not a good outcome. We want to be working on small stuff. So Agile is all about identifying the smallest possible unit of work that we can that our customers will find valuable. And then implementing all of that from front to back, top to bottom. One slice at a time. There's no big story. None of the things that you're used to thinking of are necessary to do this. Projects, estimates, none of that is important. What's important is identifying the next most valuable thing and working on that next. Now, if you bring that up in a company, it's going to be met with skepticism. The managers who are used to thinking of, well, work works in a certain way, and Agile is this thing they do in engineering, which involves stand-up meetings. They're not going to be willing to change the way that they work, to throw out their quarterly plans and so forth in order to work on individual stories. They have to be convinced. So let's talk about doing that for a moment. If you're going to convince people, you have to speak their language. So what language do they speak? They speak the language of business. And there are a few business-related things that are important when we're talking about Agile ways of working. There, for example, if we look at this curve, this is a typical waterfall process, is that we are trying to minimize risk here, but the risk is very high until we start delivering, which means that you don't lower your risk until you get to the end. And there's a huge amount of dysfunction that is attached to this idea of making things less risky that doesn't work. So if we look at an Agile way of doing it, right, is that the basic idea here is that we have to get rid of risk by thinking in other ways. So with an Agile way of working, we will work in small chunks. We'll invest in small chunks. And we'll do those one at a time, building the most valuable things first. Well, if we work in small pieces and we're releasing every day or two, and we're always doing the things that are most important, the risk goes down almost immediately. So from a business point of view, that's a huge thing. So you want to convince people, that's the first thing to start talking about. You want to start saying, okay, we're going to reduce risk. What else do business people talk about? Right? Well, the main problem, the other thing that business people talk about that's important is that they talk about cost. They talk about profit, about how much money are we going to make. The cost of working in an Agile or in a waterfall way is very high, and it never gets lower. It starts out high, it stays high while you're developing, and then when you release, it usually gets even higher. It's just inherent in the way things work. If you look at the cost of an Agile way of working, well, if it's your very first project, it's going to start out expensive because there's a lot of training and a lot of flailing around and that sort of thing, kind of learning what you're doing. But if it's not your first project, you don't have that overhead. And the cost of doing things in an Agile way goes down over time because you're constantly improving. So when you play, so the other thing that's the other thing the business people are going to talk about. They'll talk about profit. They're saying working in this way, it reduces risk, and at the same time, it reduces cost. What more could you ask for from a business point of view? The other side of cost, of course, is revenue. If you look at a waterfall project, you're making no money. You're spending money until you release. With an Agile project, you start releasing immediately, which means you can start making money immediately. Once you do the 5 or 6 most valuable things, you're a few weeks into the project, you've got something you can sell. You can't sell it for much because it doesn't do much yet, but it does something useful, which means that you can start bringing in money almost immediately. There's none of this, I'm not going to invest $1 million and then not know what's going on, so you better give me some milestones. It's more, I'm going to invest a few $1,000s in a week's worth of work or 2 weeks worth of work, and then we'll release it and we'll see if anybody will buy it. And that'll tell us if it's worth building the rest of it or not. And more to the point, it gives you some revenue while you're doing all this. So there are other sides of this, is that the difference between building in an Agile way and building in a waterfall way is the so-called cost of delay, and cost of delay is expensive. The cost of delay basically is the money that you could have made had you released earlier, which you are not making because you're not releasing. And we need to minimize the cost of delay also. And then the final issue with working in an Agile way, which is important, is that you can't do long upfront plans because we're learning as we're working. We do the high value stories first, and the high value stories bring in the most of our money, and the lower value stories become optional at that point. So if you're working on a fixed budget, then you want to be working in terms of high value stuff. So the basic idea here then is that we need to present these ideas to ways that make sense to the business. Now, once they make some sense of it, once they understand what we're trying to accomplish, then we can start talking about changes. There are a lot of business-related changes you have to make in order to make this work. So the planning process, for example, is very different. I should say, by the way, I choose this picture very deliberately. This is a picture of the Churchill War Rooms in London. They're in the basement of the what used to be the Treasury building. I've been told that the Treasury building has just been sold to somebody, but I assume the museum is still in there. And this is where they planned World War II. This is the room in which they ran World War II. And notice that they are running World War II with sticky notes on the wall, is that they were very agile. And they had to be, because in a wartime situation, the situation on the ground is constantly changing in unpredictable ways, and you have to adapt based on the way things are changing on the ground. Without adapting, you cannot be agile. So people in most businesses, though, think we're working in a factory. They have ridiculous metrics that they define productivity by that make sense in a factory and make no sense in the software world. They monitor us and look at the way we work as if we were working in a factory. They come up with big upfront plans as if they were dealing with factory equipment, which is expensive and hard to change. They come up with these idiotic roadmaps where you map how to get from point A to point B. Roadmaps don't work. Instead of a roadmap, if you're working in an agile way, you've got to be thinking in terms of a C chart. We're doing the equivalent of rounding the horn, right? What we map out are the goal, where we're headed, the strategic goal. We map out the hazards, the things that'll be in the way, the things that will prevent us from getting to that goal. And then we map our current position. And every day we map the new position and look around and we say, okay, there's the goal. And here's where we are. How do we get towards the goal from our current place? It's not something that you can do way in advance. So we're making reactive course changes. We change based on what the wind is, which means that we have to be planning dynamically. Planning becomes a dynamic process. It's not something you do once a year or once every 3 months. It's something that you're doing all the time. So estimate-based stuff doesn't work in this world. If I were to make an estimate about how long it takes to go around the horn based on the average time required to implement stories, I'd say it's going to take 10 days. Well, in reality, it took, 67 days. The other thing that's important to notice here on this graph is that they were at roughly the same place on day 22 that they were on day 50. So there's a month lost here where they had to, they got far to the west and then they were driven back east by the winds. And it took them a whole month to claw their way back to where they were. And that's normal. That's natural. It happens. It's not a failure. It's part of being agile. You deal with the situation that you're handed. So we're going to be doing that by working on stories, but the list of stories will be constantly changing. The ones on top, well, we're certainly going to be doing those in the next few weeks. So we can plan on that. We can plan on the stuff that we're doing soon, right? The stuff that's most valuable to work on. The stuff underneath, well, probably when we do the stuff on top, we're going to learn things that will make the stuff on the bottom not very useful. Either it will become completely useless or we'll have to change it in some way in order to make it appropriate or order to make it useful. So most of that stuff on the bottom can just go, is that we're learning as we work, in other words. As we're pulling stories off this system, we learn stuff, which causes us to put new stories on the system. And those new stories are almost always more important, more valuable to the customer than the old stories were. So those stories on the bottom, we're never going to get to them. We just throw them out. Now, in fact, you could take this argument and say, well, what's the point of having a backlog at all? And my general feeling is, well, there isn't one. Is that some of the most agile companies I know don't have backlogs. Is what they do is what they do next week is decided by what they learned this week. So they're constantly learning. They're constantly figuring out what to do next based on what they just learned. And that's what they work on next. And you don't need any kind of backlog at all. So the opposite of that, the inagile way of thinking, is we have this big quarterly process where we come up with a quarterly plan that is going to tell us how to work. It's going to tell us what to do next. And in an agile world, you don't have that. You don't need that, right? Is that you don't need to plan much at all. But you do need a strategic goal. You need focus. So it's not like you're doing whatever random junk pops up. If you're not focused on that goal, then you don't do it at all. So what we're learning about is how to focus on the goal. So getting together every so often and looking at that goal. Is this a legitimate strategic goal for the company? That's worthwhile. Sure. And the goal's not going to change very often. So getting together every month or every few weeks or even a few months, that's fine. Right? That works fine. But coming up with tactical plans, we're going to work on, here are the stories we're going to work on for the next N months. That just is not a good way to look at things. So we're working then in an agile way. We're using the so-called inspect and adapt process to decide how we're working. We deliver something small, we hand it to our users, and then we get feedback. And that feedback could be happening as you're working. It could be, hey, come over here, take a look at this. If you're working remotely, you could say, here, let me share my screen with you and show you what I'm working on. And I want an opinion here. And then based on that feedback, you change what you're doing. It's constantly changing as the wind changes. That feedback loop is very fast, minutes to days, not weeks. So you need to be getting constant feedback from your customers. You're delivering constantly, because if you don't deliver, you can't get feedback. If you don't deliver, you have accomplished nothing. So the feedback is rapid, the feedback is continuous, and you are doing it constantly. Now, the other issue is that speed does matter, because what matters is the speed of feedback, the speed at which you can get feedback, which means that you have to build a system for doing this based on trust. And I don't know, this is kind of misplaced trust, I think. If my mother was to put me against the board and start throwing knives at me, I'm not sure that I would trust her, but these kids certainly seem to trust her. But be that as it may, we need to be able to trust the people in the organization to do the work, because we can't work fast enough if we don't have trust inside of our organization. Taking a picture here from John Cutler. If we trust people, we just do it and we're done. If we don't trust people, we need elaborate processes to put in place in order to deal with our distrust. So ultimately, things get back to that notion of autonomy. The teams are autonomous. They have to make their own decisions. They decide how they work. They go out and talk to the users. They build something, get some feedback, and then make a change. They don't ask anybody. They don't pass things up the bureaucracy. They don't send in requisitions to a product group who's going to chew on it for 6 months before they decide whether they're going to build it or not. They just do it. They just make the change, which of course means they have to know how to do that. There has to be product expertise on the team, or you can't pull that off. But the teams are working in an autonomous way. Without autonomy, you have no agility. But when I come in as a consultant to many organizations, what I see are the teams marching in lockstep. Every team is doing exactly the same thing. Well, you don't have any autonomy if that's happening. It's an agile organization. Every team is going to be changing the way it works constantly. So if you want an indication of autonomy, if everybody in the organization is doing Scrum, you're not an agile organization, because you have no autonomy there. The teams are not self-organized. They are not working in ways that make sense for them. You are not allowing them to improve the way they work, which is to say that if you see this going on, you have management that is deliberately preventing, as a matter of policy, they are deliberately preventing the teams from being able to get better. But what are we accomplishing there? Nothing. So these management hierarchies with somebody at the top that makes a decision and then they pass that decision down to the person underneath, it doesn't work. You know, in agile teams, there's a lot of management going on, but it's happening at the team level. There aren't really many managers. So you can get rid of all of that dead weight. You can get rid of all of the managers that are basically implementing a bureaucracy and replace it with something that works better. So the idea here then is that, again, we're getting back to this idea of a system. You start thinking in terms of dynamic planning. You start thinking in terms of autonomous teams deciding what you do next. And all of a sudden, the management structure, which exists to support a waterfall way of working, makes no sense anymore. You have a new process. The new process requires its own unique support. And if you leave the old hierarchical structure in place, well, they're going to pull the process back to something that the hierarchical structure understands. So if the existing hierarchical structure remains in place, there's no way that you can have any agility. You don't become agile by bringing in an army of trainers. You become agile by changing the way that the organization works. If the organization is working in a new way, the way that you manage that work has got to change. So the way that the work changes in agile world is you end up with a management that is involved. You don't pass information up to them. Rather, they walk down to you and they talk to you. Right? A lot of jokes have been made about management by walking around, which is not the best way to look at it. But the basic idea here is that managers in this world are a support role. Is that what they do is they walk down, they talk to people on the teams, and they say to the people on the teams, how can we help? And the problem then is that if they're telling the teams what to do, the teams are not improving. If you don't tell the teams what to do and you let them be autonomous, well, then they improve as best they can. But they can't do that unless people from the outside and the rest of the organization are helping them with the big picture problems that the individual teams can't solve. So management in this world becomes a helping support role. Now, people talk about servant leadership. I hate that term. The people that are helping you at the organizational level are not your servants. It's not like they're taking out the trash for you. Is that they are rather organizational. They're people whose work is making the organization better as compared to your work, which is to make the software better. It's all about making things better. It's all about improving. So we're working together. This is not a servant relationship. So this notion of servant leader, I think, is nonsensical. It's that we're just really not doing things in a servant-based kind of way. So everything has to change. Management has to change. The structure of the organization has to change. The teams have to be empowered. They have to start doing things that's actually going to get work done faster. What we're trying to do here is get some agility into the organization. We're not trying to do agile. I don't even know what that means. I try to avoid that word, right? The capital A agile word. I try to avoid it because I don't even know what it means. Certainly doesn't mean bring in a big process that somebody else invented and implement it by rote. So it brings us back to that notion of the system. Is that agile is a system. It impacts everything. Every aspect of the organization. Everything has to change from the CEO down to the janitors. And if the organization is not going to do that, then you don't really have any agility. You can try and be agile in the corner, right? As people say, oh, we can't change big organizations. That's just not possible. So we'll be agile on the team. But again, it's a system. Saying we're going to be agile on the team is like saying we're going to make the car faster by swapping out this one wire and replacing it with a better quality wire. No, it doesn't work that way, right? It's not going to make a car faster. You can't make anything faster by tweaking one thing. But even if it's a big thing, we're going to make the car faster by putting in a Ferrari engine. But no, that's not going to make the car faster either because the engine is going to tear the car apart. It's going to be destroyed. The car will be destroyed. The only way to make the car faster is to look at the system as a whole and to change the system as a whole. And that's what agility is about. It's about learning and it's about changing. It's about looking around you, seeing what works and what doesn't, and then making changes so that you amplify the good, you make the things that work better, and you get rid of the things that don't work. And that's a constant process. And it involves every aspect of the organization. So is this hard? Sure. But if you don't do it, we're going to end up going the way of the dodo. Darwin is right here, right? As natural selection applies, is that what'll happen is that the unfit organizations that are not working in an agile way will eventually wither away. It might take a while. We've been doing this for 20, 30 years now, and agile has, the things I'm talking about have not become commonplace, right? This thing that they call agile TM is everywhere, but that's got nothing to do with agility. That, the fact is, it has to do with resisting agility, doing the opposite of what you need to do. So if you're not doing the things I'm talking about, though, I can guarantee that eventually the company is going to go away. For many companies, that's going to be sooner rather than later. The giant corporations will take longer, of course, because they have more momentum. But the small companies, they'll disappear almost immediately if they're not working in effective ways. And most of us work for small companies. So if you're going to do this Agile thing, you should do this Agile thing. It's all about change, just to kind of sum up, is that it's about big changes everywhere. And you can't do that with slogans. You can't do it by doing things by rote. Although to do it, you really just need to do it. So that's what I have to talk about. Are there any questions? Let's go to questions. There must be some questions here.
Yeah, there are some questions.
Okay.
And yeah, thank you very much for the brilliant talk. There was a lot of discussions while you were talking. There was this whole life happening in Slack.
That's a good thing.
Right. So actually, people are a bit confused about how to sell this agility higher up to the management, to the old traditional organizations, because it's a challenge.
It is a challenge. And one of the things that I said earlier that I want to repeat is that you have to speak their language, right? The only way that you can sell Agile, well, first of all, the idea of selling Agile, if you're explaining it properly, there's not really much to sell.
Yeah.
Right. But you have to put it in terms that the business people understand, or they're not going to understand what you're talking about. You can never get a business person to start doing Agile things if you start talking about stand-up meetings and backlog grooming, because that just stuff is uninteresting to them. What you have to talk about is we will increase our revenue faster. We will start bringing in money where we couldn't bring in money before. We will end up having happier customers than they would, because their problems will get solved quickly. They won't have to, if they have a problem right now, they'll get a solution in a week, not a year from now. We need to talk about basically everything, right? Revenue going up, profits going up, right? These are all things that make sense to the business. So the other way to think about it is that if I'm brought into, I get very nervous. Let's put it this way. When somebody calls me up and says, we want you to come in as a consultant, and I say, why? What exactly do you want me to do? And they don't know. And we want you to help us be more agile. Well, do you know what that means? Right? I think maybe you don't know. I think maybe that word means something other than what you think it does. Is that where I'll start off, as I say, is okay. What problems is the business having? What are the business problems right now? What are the things that are keeping you up at night? And then let's talk about how we could solve those problems by using things out of an Agile toolbox. And those solutions might involve changing to the whole organization. They might involve lots of things. But the point here is that Agile is a tool that you use to solve business problems. So you make changes by focusing on the business problems.
Was there any kind of situations when you came to the company and you see that they don't want to change, and you go away?
Well, I'm kind of expensive, so they wouldn't bring me in. They wouldn't bring me in if they didn't want to change. The problem is not that they don't want to change. The problem is they don't know how. They understand that things aren't working, but they don't know why. And the problems emerge not because they don't want to change, but rather because they won't accept the changes they have to make in order to get the improvements that they want to have. And, I can't force anybody to do anything. Diana Larson says this really well. She says, I'm not in the convincing business. And I agree with that. I'm not in the convincing business. I'm not trying to convince you. What I am doing is saying, well, here we are, and here's where we want to go. And I know personally that if we want to get from here to there, the best way to do that is like this. Yeah. And if they're going, well, we can't possibly do that. Well, my job is done then. Right. Yeah. And so, there's not much I can do about that. And as I say, change your company or change your company, right?
Exactly. Or like, this old joke about how many psychologists you need to change a light bulb. It's only one, but the light bulb needs to, it should want to be changed.
It should want to be changed. It needs to understand that it needs to be changed. Yes. Yeah, that's true.
Actually, when you talk about Jira, there was several commands about, but what else? What else to use except Jira?
I use a whiteboard with sticky notes on it. And if I'm working remotely, I use a virtual whiteboard with sticky notes on it. I'm a big fan of Miro or Mural, either one. They both work perfectly well. That's all you need. If we're going to be flexible, we have to have some flexibility, right? And the stories, right, is that if you have so many of them that you need a program to manage them, you've got way too many. If there's so many details in the story that you need a program to capture those details, well, then you're capturing them too soon. You want to be having a conversation where you get those details in just before you implement. If you have to write it down, then to remember it, you're capturing the information too soon. And in fact, you're getting even more details as you're working, because you're like saying to your customer, here's what I'm working on. Let's take a look at it. Tell me what you think. Give me some feedback here. Right. So the details are changing all the time. And Jira is just it's doing the wrong thing. Is that it's not helping us with our work in an agile way. What it's trying to do is waterfall requirements gathering. And we don't do that.
It's forcing us to fill in the details.
It's forcing you to fill in the details. And in fact, since it monitors you, it's also surveillance software. If you don't fill in the details, then management is going to be beating on you, right? Because they don't understand that they're not working in a waterfall anymore, that they're not working in a factory anymore. It's a mess, right? So whiteboards. I go for whiteboards, right? Is that if it doesn't fit on a sticky note, it's too big.
Yeah, just one command came in Slack that if you're using whiteboard, you're also reducing costs, because Jira is crazy expensive.
Well, yeah, the cost is like, right, it's crazy. And whiteboard, well, of course, the Agile industrial complex, of which Jira is part, doesn't want you to be using sticky notes on a whiteboard, virtual or otherwise, because they don't make any money off of it. So they're going to be fighting against this. Yeah. Right. If you suggest using whiteboards, they're going to have like this vast army of salespeople trying to convince managers to not do that. And they'll come up with lots of stupid reasons that are not true. So you have to kind of keep the management away from the clutches of the salespeople. But yeah. Doing things the right way is usually the most cost-effective way. It's the simplest way. And simple usually is not very expensive.
Yeah. Okay. There's another command. Maybe Atlassian should hire you as a consultant.
I'm open. I'm a consultant, right? I'm always looking for work.
Right. Yeah, I hope I covered all the questions that I found in Slack. Maybe I missed something, so maybe you can look in Slack after this.
I'll take a look after.
Find out, because there's a lot of things that happened during the talk. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the insights, and thank you very much for joining. It was really, really nice. And yeah, it's awesome.
You're welcome.
And now we finalize. You're the last speaker, and we're finalizing our journey for today. And hope people enjoy that. And yeah, have a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody. You too, and so same for everybody else. And thanks very much for spending some of your precious time listening to me rant. So that I appreciate that. And feel free. I'll go to Slack after, and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions later. Email or Twitter is the best way to do that.